Do you think you can get such a job without a degree if you're completely self-taught? How did you prepare for your job interview? How did you get noticed? And how would you recommend people get found by these companies and actually find a job there?
There are two distinct phases to being able to get that job at big tech.
In this episode of the Coding in Flow podcast, I will be talking to Rahul Pandey, who is an Android engineer at Facebook. And we will answer pretty much all questions you had about how to get into such a big tech company. Like if you need a computer science degree to get in, or if it's enough if you are self-taught like me. What kind of projects you should build for your portfolio to raise your chances to get noticed by a recruiter. What questions they will ask you at the job interview. How much you can earn at such a big tech company, and if the work quality is really as good as people imagine. So this episode is really packed with information. It's super interesting. I hope you enjoy it. But do me one favor, share this episode with at least one other programmer that could benefit from it, because it's really a win-win situation. You help this channel and this podcast grow, and you do your friend a favor, so your friend will be thankful to you. So please go ahead and share this, and then I wish you a lot of fun with this episode. And before we begin, I would like to thank the sponsor for this episode, which is the Stream Chat SDK. With Stream, you can build a fully fledged chat app with features like group chats, attachments, reactions, and offline support in very little time. If you've ever tried to build a chat like this from scratch before, you know that this is actually really difficult and error-prone. Stream makes it easy because they provide all the complicated low-level code. Everything works right out of the box, but at the same time you can customize it at any level you want. It's completely free if you're making less than $10,000 in monthly revenue and have less than 5 team members. You can use it on Android with Kotlin or Java, XML or Jetpack Compose, and it also supports many other languages and platforms. If you're planning to add a chat to your app, do yourself a favor and give Stream a try. To find out more, click the link in the description or visit getstream.io/codinginflow. Okay, so first of all, I want to congratulate you to 20,000 subscribers on YouTube, which you reached recently. And of course, I will put a link to your YouTube channel into the show notes so people can take a look at it later. And first of all, since you work at Facebook, I was wondering, how can I hack my girlfriend's Facebook account?
I get that
No, I'm
question
just
a lot.
kidding. I'm just kidding. Joke's on me, I don't even have a girlfriend, but many people wonder about this. No, but since you work at Facebook, I was wondering, what does a day for you at Facebook typically look like? What, as much as you're comfortable with talking about this, what are your tasks? What is your job role? And yeah, what do you basically do all day?
Yeah, so I think that Facebook and these other big companies are inherent, like by definition, they're big, right? And so depending on what part of the company you are, what part of the stack you work on, your day will look quite different. But I can share, an example day on my end as one data point. And I think I'll mention that I guess I'm a little bit unique in the sense that I have this job, but I also do a lot of stuff on the side, like YouTube and teaching. But for me, I think a normal day, so the team that I work on is about empowering other developers in the company to be able to build faster and build better, higher quality products. So it's basically a developer infrastructure role, which is a little bit different or quite different from a product developer role. And so in any given day, I'll typically have at least 1 or 2 meetings where I talk to product teams about what are the needs that they have, what are the concerns they have with using the infrastructure that my team develops, and how can I help them or unblock them, either immediately in like tactical value or maybe in terms of road mapping. Like a lot of the time is spent in how can we set up our team and their team for success in the next 6 months or 9 months or whatever. And then of course, as a software engineer, a lot of the time it's also going to be spent coding, and maybe not coding, but I would say more accurately reading code or debugging. So it's not necessarily always writing code, but a lot of it will be spent in, there's a bug you're chasing down, and oftentimes you're going to be reading tons and tons of code, and the actual code change you make will end up being a couple lines, which solves the problem. But to get there, you have to read thousands of lines of code, right? That's a pretty common occurrence, I think, at a big tech company. And so, yeah, I would say like team meetings, a lot of time spent debugging, reading, or writing code. And then, of course, there's also a lot of like one-on-ones with people on the team where you talk about, what are they working on? How can you help? Career growth, things like that.
The name of your role you have there is lead developer, right? That's how it's called.
Technically, I if you look at the actual like employment system, I don't think there is a name attached to the role. But if you look at the level, I guess you could call it a staff engineer. So if you look at the equivalent level at other companies, it would be called a staff engineer.
Okay, I think this was actually the word I read earlier, not lead developer, staff engineer. Yeah, this was something I was going to ask later, how much time you actually spend in meetings and how much time you actually spend writing code, but you already explained this. Then I can also add another question to this. How many hours would you say do you work per week overall?
Yeah, I feel like it depends quite a bit. I think one of the good things about this big tech company is that, it's not going to come crashing down. Like there's some amount of stability. I have a pretty high degree of confidence that my role or the company will still be around. And so there are some weeks where I'm actually quite busy and there's a deadline coming up, especially like, for example, holiday time. November, December are the biggest months for these ad-driven companies. And so you need to make sure that everything is landed and stable by October or early November. Yeah, I think it depends on when we're talking about. Like one of the things about these big companies is that it is very bursty in the sense that you might have a SEV. A SEV is what we call internally like a big issue with the site or the mobile app. Like something is crashing for a large number of people. And of course, if you have a SEV going on, then you have to jump on it no matter what time of day it is. And also, if you are preparing for the holiday season code freeze, like November and December are the critical months for these ad-driven companies. And so the months of September, October are quite busy. But there are also times when things are a little bit lighter. And I would say like, on a good week where there's not as much in terms of commitments, and maybe it's like 40, 45 hours. But on a busy week, it could easily turn into 50, 60 hours a week.
Yeah, this reminds me of something Don mentioned in the podcast episode I had with him. He's a freelancer, full-time, and he mentioned that he from time to time, I think about once every 3 months on average, he has something that he refers to as a hell week.
Yeah.
So this happens usually around when your versions are shipped and stuff like that. So when there is more work to be done, then it can become really there can be a lot to do, and then sometimes he has these really bad weeks that are full of work where he has to work for many hours and can't focus so much on his social life. But those are usually just short phases, and then he has phases where the work is more relaxed, where he has more work-life balance. So from what you say, it sounds like there are these phases in your work as well, where you have weeks where there's more to do, and then weeks or months where there is a bit more relaxed, where it's a bit more relaxed.
I think that's exactly right. And I think there's one other layer in a tech company which probably doesn't exist in the freelance world, which is on-call. So pretty much everyone at Facebook, if you're an engineer, or pretty much any tech company, there's some sort of on-call cadence where, if you're on a team of 5 or 6 people, every 5 or 6 weeks, you're going to be on call. And then, of course, I think during that on-call week, the idea is that you are essentially the first line of defense for any kind of question or issue that comes up. And so you have to prepare to be a little bit more busy during that week. So I think that's probably something that only happens in a medium or large tech company compared to, in freelancing, you probably don't have that.
Yeah, would you say that working at a big tech company is as good as people imagine, or would you say it's, I mean, of course, you can't, maybe on video, you don't want to say that your job is not perfect, but do you think it's as good as people imagine, or do they have some too lofty hopes for how working at such a big tech company actually is?
It's an interesting question. I feel like there are a ton of benefits to working at these big tech companies. I think a lot of people value getting into Microsoft, Google, Apple, these big companies, because I think, first of all, they pay well, and it's pretty well known. You can look up online what kind of compensation band they have, and that's certainly true. There's also stability. And there's also, I think, a big part of it is career growth. So that if you look at like an entry-level developer role, you're already making a lot more than what most people who are consulting or freelancing will make. And then the appealing thing about it is that if you are able to climb up the ladder, then the compensation increase isn't linear. It actually goes up kind of geometrically or exponentially. And so if you're like a very, very senior engineer, you're making not like 3x more than a junior engineer, you're making 5x or 7x, like quite a bit more. So I think that's one part of it, which is certainly pretty unique or amazing about these big companies. And the final thing I'll mention is that I think the other benefit of working at one of these companies is that it opens up opportunity. And that is something that's hard to put a price tag on, but you kind of feel empowered. It's like, okay, I got this job, and now a lot of companies, there's a lot of inbound interest in my profile, and I just feel like I can go out and I can either do my own startup or I can get that other job that I really want. It gives you confidence. And I think that confidence is something that a lot of people overlook, but it's actually very, very valuable in a career.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned that the income grows more exponentially and not so much linearly when you climb up the career ladder, which must be really nice, because this is one of the downsides of jobs usually when you compare it to something like entrepreneurship, that you can't really get big raises at a time. You usually have this small incremental growth over the years, which is a reason often why people dream of becoming or becoming an entrepreneur, because then you have this potential of this exponential growth where you really make a lot of money after a few years. But if it's like you say, that you really can get a raise of, I mean, you don't get a raise of 10x at once, do you? But the growth is more exponential in comparison to other jobs.
Yeah, that's right. I think that the other thing that sometimes people don't realize with these tech companies, at least in California, which is where I am, and especially like in the US, a lot of the compensation will come in the form of equity. And that's something that is also relatively unique if you're coming from a freelance or consulting world, which is that especially as you become more senior, the majority of your compensation is going to come from the equity component. And given how well the tech industry has done broadly over the past 5 or 10 years, that equity component becomes much larger than your base salary. And that's really where you see this pretty huge gain.
So equity means that you get a small piece of the company, basically. So you get stocks, right? Or
yeah, so
that's called.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. So basically they're called restricted stock units, or RSUs. And the idea is that you'll be given a certain number of them. So like a certain number of Google stock, for example, or a certain number of Facebook stock. And at smaller companies, because the company is illiquid, it's not publicly traded yet, you might get an actual percentage. You get options so that if the company does get an exit or goes IPO eventually, then you're able to turn those options into stock, which will have a ton of value given that outcome.
Yeah, that sounds really appealing. Of course, many people are really interested in getting into such a big tech company. So maybe let's talk a little bit about how did you get in there? Do you think, or is it possible to get into a big tech company? And with big tech, I mean companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, these typical Faang companies. Faang stands for Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, right?
Mm-hmm.
So do you think you can get such a job without a degree if you're completely self-taught? And maybe we can talk a little bit about how did you prepare for your job interview? How did you get noticed? And yeah, then we can touch on the details a little bit more. But yeah, how did you get into it, and how would you recommend people get found by these companies and actually find a job there?
Yeah, so I think that I get this question a lot, and I think there are two distinct phases to being able to get that job at big tech. And also, by the way, I think Faang is a very interesting term. I think that people are really they really want to get a Faang job. But I think the reality of the situation is that there's a ton of really great companies that are not part of the acronym. Like, for example, I mean, just off the top of my head, Airbnb, Robinhood, Pinterest, like these are amazing companies to work at. Uber, yeah. I mean, these are all great companies that have done engineering. On the engineering side, they're really smart people who work there, and they're solving tough problems, but they're not captured in Faang. So I think that if we expand the definition a little bit, I think people can be happier, and they don't need to be so like focused on just those 4 or 5 companies in Faang.
Yeah, makes sense.
But I think the process is similar no matter which company you want to go for. There are 2 distinct phases. Number 1 is, are you getting the interview? And then if you're not, then I'll talk about like some of the tactics I have to help you get the interview. And then once you get the interview, the preparation you do pivots or changes completely almost. So if you're not even getting the interview, like if you're self-taught, for example, and you don't have the infrastructure or the network of people around you to be able to get in touch with the recruiter, for example, then I think the burden is on you to demonstrate your capability as an engineer. And I think you've talked about this in a couple of your videos, Florian, but I think largely it just comes down to, have you published an app on your own? Or is there some demonstration of your work through a client or through some contract that you can say, hey, I built this, and you can check out the quality, and therefore you can see my competency as an Android developer or as iOS developer, whatever it might be. So like building out personal projects or side projects is critical to being able to demonstrate that you're able to, that the company should take a bet on you and interview you. I think in my case, it was a little bit different because I had the luxury of this whole network and infrastructure, right? I went to Stanford, which is in the middle of Silicon Valley. And so literally every month or every couple months, there would be a career fair where a bunch of companies would come in and they would try and recruit students. And so for me, it was very easy to walk in and basically hand my resume out to people. And I had a pretty good idea of being able to at least get the interview. And so that's the first stage. Like, is the company interested enough in you to offer you the interview? And then the second part of it is getting the job once you're getting the interview. And I think for that, that's where we have to start talking about DSA, or data structures and algorithms. So largely at these companies, the majority of them are going to be asking you questions about data structures and algorithms, things like binary search trees, linked lists, queues, stacks, and manipulating them. A lot of these are whiteboarding questions. And I think there's a lot of people who, a lot of discussion has been had around, is that the best way to actually assess people to be a software engineer at these companies? Because the reality is, like, as an engineer at Facebook, I very, very rarely, if at all, use any of the skills to prepare for the DSA portion of the interview. But the reality is that today, at least, that's how many of these companies operate. And so you just have to kind of spend a month, 2 months, 3 months grinding out a lot of these questions. And there's really only like 15 or 20 patterns that you have to recognize. And once you recognize those patterns, then a lot of the DSA questions become quite a bit easier. And then once you clear those, you can get the offer, hopefully.
Yeah, in my interview with Ryan Kay recently, he explained it to me like this, if I understood him correctly, that these data structures and algorithms concepts play a bigger role in companies where they have large apps, because the larger the app, the more these little optimizations play a role and the more important they are. If you have a small app, then you can get away with doing things inefficiently. But if you have an app like Google Search itself, then you really have to optimize it a lot. So this seems to be one reason why data structures and algorithms are so important in these interviews with these large companies, if I understood him correctly. Do you think that's correct?
I have a little bit of a different take. I think that if you're a product developer at Microsoft or Google or Facebook, speaking from personal experience, if you're just building out a new widget or if you're constructing a new part of the application, the chance that you actually think about a lot of the underlying mechanisms of performance and data structures of how your app is working is very little. Like, very few people actually think about that on the job. Usually what will happen is that there'll be a team, or there'll be someone who like kind of architected the whole thing, and maybe that person thinks about the runtime complexity and what algorithms to use. But the vast majority of engineers don't actually think about that on a regular basis. So I do think that there is a disconnect where when you're trying to get into these companies, you are being asked all these questions, but the actual application of that on the job is almost none. But I do think there is value because when you're given these questions, you it's not just the algorithm that's being tested. I think a lot of it is also like
your logical thinking, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Like your communication. So, hey, explain what you did. And I think a large part of how you succeed in a tech company is the collaboration with other people. When you get stuck, how do you ask for help? Are you able to have a conversation with the interviewer to figure out something together, right? So it goes a little bit beyond the actual DSA, and it goes into kind of teamwork and problem solving.
Yeah, this makes sense. So if I understood it correctly, then people can get in without a computer science degree.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. And in fact, it happens quite a bit.
Okay. And then they usually have to apply to these companies themselves, or do they have to get found?
I think that for these big tech companies, there's so much inbound. So if you just apply, there's a very good chance that you'll never hear back from the company. So almost always, what I recommend people is either a referral. So if you know someone who knows you and trusts you and like thinks you're doing good work, if they work at one of these companies, a referral is a huge leg up in being able to get a call back. And the other thing is what we talked about earlier, which is if you have a published Android app, for example, and it has a meaningful number of people who are using it, that's also really impressive. So that can be a way to stand out.
Okay, so the app should actually be published, or is it enough if it just is on GitHub?
I think ideally it's published, because basically what you want it to be as easy as possible for the hiring manager or the recruiter to be able to look at your work and figure out that it's impressive, or people are getting value out of it, right? And so if you publish on GitHub, yeah, maybe I could tell, but you're making me work a lot harder. But if you publish it and it has like a 4.5 star review and 10,000 people are using it, it's very, very obvious to me that, hey, you've built something which has value, and I'm sure you could do the same thing at my company. So I think publishing it makes it much more obvious if you have that option.
Yeah, I think there is quite a bit of a difference between having really an app on the Play Store and just having a project on GitHub. Because if it's just on GitHub, then you can ignore a lot of stuff. But if it's actually on the Play Store, then you probably have, for example, proper tests for your app, because you have to make sure that it keeps working and you don't break it with an update. So you really have to focus on stuff that you can ignore if it's just a project on GitHub. So I can see how this makes sense. Is there a specific kind of project that people should build, or should it have a certain size? I assume that just building a small CRUD app where people just do some database operations, this is probably not enough.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I feel like my answer here is maybe it's a little controversial, but I think that it doesn't matter that much. What I care more about is, are you able to create software which people are getting value from? And so like the complexity of what you've done doesn't actually matter to me that much. It's much more about, hey, you built out maybe this dice rolling app or like some simple application, but the fact that you made it really clean, really polished, and people are actually using it, that is a really good indication to me that you're a good software engineer. You've thought through everything. You've made sure there are no bugs or no obvious issues. And that is, to me, the mark of a good software engineer. So the actual like algorithmic complexity of what you've built, that doesn't really weigh that much for me into how I assess engineer. Because as a solo developer, it's hard to really like, what are you going to do? It's hard to really create like some enterprise solution or like some very complicated thing, which is actually useful, right? A lot of it is going to be utility apps, and those actually have a ton of value.
Okay, so this is a really good point for people to put a real app into the Play Store. And I think it's also a fun way to learn when you have your own project out there. I also heard you mention in another video that Git and complicated Git commands play a really big role in your job. So should people focus on learning Git intensively?
I don't think that needs to necessarily be something that you prepare for in anticipation of getting the job, because a lot of that you'll be able to learn when you get there. I think that having some knowledge of version control is important in order to succeed at the company, because inherently you're going to be working with hundreds of developers, and being able to quickly check out their code and test things out and make modifications or cherry pick changes between branches, that will really help you as a developer. But it's not something that will come up as part of the interview process. So I don't think, if you're purely optimizing for landing that job, I don't think you should actually focus on version control. That's something you should, learn on the job once you get it.
Okay, that's good to know. And you also have a project or some kind of learning community that's called Tech Career Growth. Is that right? Can you explain a little bit more what that is?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. So the idea here is that there are so many people out there who want to be able to get that tech job, or maybe they already work in tech, but they want to get promoted. They want to advance their career faster. And I think a lot of the advice out there is not very good, frankly. I think there's a lot of people know that there's a lot of money if you're able to land a job in tech. And so basically there's a whole industry of people who want to sell you tools or content or resume templates, which they claim will help you get that big tech job, which will pay you a bunch of money, right? And people are willing to pay that because, hey, it might double my compensation, so I might as well pay $500 for the chance to increase my compensation. And so the idea of Tech Career Growth is we're trying to just give a lot of the information. My friend Alex and I were trying to give a lot of the information away for free based on our experience. And because we're giving it away for free, there's really we're not trying to upsell you on anything or trying to push you to do anything. It's just really our experience, what we think will be the most valuable for you to get that first tech job, or to, get promoted and accelerate your career if that's what you want.
And that's a LinkedIn group, right?
Yeah, so the community lives on a couple of different places. We have a pretty big LinkedIn company or LinkedIn group, and we also live on Slack. And the primary way that we interact with the community is actually through, every couple of weeks, we have a live session where we have like 500 people, and we all basically have a presentation. I'll basically explain a concept, and then people can ask questions about it.
Okay, I will make sure to put a link to this into the show notes later.
Perfect.
On YouTube, this will be the video description. And later, when I upload the audio version of this podcast, this will be the show notes. But there, people can find a link to this community. So I recommend that they check this out. It probably makes sense either way, even if they don't plan to apply to a larger tech company. Even then, they should check it out. And people are also wondering, what are your personal learning strategies and where do you learn new stuff from? Do you have a specific source, or do you always just type it into Google and then use whatever you can find when you try to learn a new topic?
Yeah, I don't think I have a particular source when I'm trying to learn something. A lot of it is, I think, people driven. So like there are particular people who I trust either within the company, and I say, hey, like if they've written a note about something or if they made a code change, I will go out of my way to look at that code change and learn from like, what do they do? How do they do it? Or if there are particular people like on YouTube, like, okay, I know Florian, you make great tutorials. So like if you make something, I'll actually check it out. And I can trust that there's been a lot of research behind it. And similarly, like on Google, I try and find people who, like on Stack Overflow, like reputation matters a lot because it's a very strong indication of, okay, this person has been around the block and they know what they're talking about. So I don't really have a particular like website or anything in mind. It just, I try and find people who I think they know what they're talking about, and I can trust what they're doing with a higher degree of confidence.
So when you work at a company like Facebook, then you get mentored a little bit. You have people that you can ask, right?
Yeah, like back to like what we talked about, like why do people want to work at big tech? I think that's one really big thing compared to working at a tiny company or on your own. One of the biggest perks of being at a company, a big tech company, is that guaranteed there are going to be people who are better than you at some dimension of software engineering, right? And the amazing thing about most of these companies is that it's pretty open. Like you can literally go in and see every code change they've made in the past year, or like for the whole time they've been at the company. You can look at, what comments are they leaving on other people's code changes. And there's a huge amount of value in being able to look at how really talented people operate. And you can figure out, okay, what is the gap between what I'm doing and what are they doing? Like, how are they able to achieve so much more than me? And that's something that I think is unique to, like you need to be able to find people like that in order to learn from them. And that's what big tech companies will give you in a big way.
And when you started, when you had your first days there, did you feel overwhelmed?
I think almost everyone feels overwhelmed because, especially at these big tech companies, everything is custom, or most things are going to be unique to that company. Version control, the code review process, the way you like the developer environment is going to be actually very different from what you're probably used to as a indie developer. And so I think at least for the first 1 or 2 weeks, you're going to feel really overwhelmed with all the different tools and technology. But that's where, having a buddy, like having a mentor or a manager who can help guide you through that process becomes really valuable. And I think most of these companies will have some pretty structured onboarding process where, they'll help you get familiar with what the tools are and how do you use them.
And when we are really honest, does everyone have what it takes to get there? I mean, it's a nice thing to say that everyone can learn this and everyone can land a job at a big tech company. But when we take a look at how difficult it actually is to get in there, would you say that there are people who are just not smart enough to, and it's fine to be honest, in my opinion. Would you say that there are people who are just not smart enough to get into a company like Facebook or Google? Because what I think is, yes, I can imagine that there are certain people who want to learn programming who just don't have what it takes to get there. Doesn't mean they can't pursue a career in programming, but maybe Google or Facebook are not the right targets for them.
I think that, the answer is probably yes. There probably do exist people in the world who, they just don't have the work ethic, or they're not smart enough potentially to actually make it in. But I think by and large, the answer is that it is possible. Because I think one thing that is a big misconception out there is that getting into these big tech companies is not a meritocratic process. It is simply not. So much of it is driven by you went to the right college, or someone who works there who can refer you, right? It's like the gap of opportunity for, like, a lot of the people in the community are international, right? Like they are in India, or some people are in Europe. And the fact of the matter is that it is actually significantly harder to get into these big tech companies if you're from there compared to if you're in California, right? I'm in San Francisco. And so it is significantly easier here because I know a ton of people who work at these companies. So I think the short answer is that you're probably right. There might exist some population where they'll never make it. But for the vast majority of people, I think if they work hard enough, and there's some amount of luck involved, if they know the right people, or if they are able to get noticed with some app they published, they will be able, they have the potential to succeed at one of these companies.
Okay, and do you have any tips on finding such a referral? I mean, if I understand it correctly, it makes sense to move to certain cities because it's easier to network with the right people there.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things here. One is that the most like deterministic path, like the most non-luck driven path, is try and move to a bigger city and work at a medium-sized tech company. And what'll happen is over time, people always will switch jobs every 2, 3, 4 years. And then eventually someone at that medium-sized company or small company will go on to another company where they'll know someone who goes on and goes to a big company, right? Like guaranteed, you're going to have like 1 degree of separation from someone who works at one of these companies eventually, if you are doing good work in a small, medium company. And so then you can leverage that to get that referral. And then once you are able to get on the radar, then you can keep applying. Like I think I failed the first couple of times I interviewed at many of these companies, but keep trying and you'll eventually make it. And the other thing I'll mention here is that one thing I think about a lot is put yourself in a position to get lucky. And this is not something that you have control over because it's luck inherently. But one thing I think about a lot is when you're making an app, rather than just putting it on GitHub, go the extra mile to actually publish it. Or maybe you're writing a blog post about some technical topic. Instead of just writing it for yourself, go out and go the extra mile to publish it and then tweet about it or put it on your LinkedIn. The more opportunities you have to put yourself out there, I think that will lead to people noticing you, people being able to give you feedback about your work. And not only will it make you better, but it can also lead to things like what we're talking about here. Someone can notice your work and say, hey, I think you'd be a really good fit for this team at this company. I'll refer you, right? And that will only happen if you go the extra mile to put yourself out there and publish your work and try and get lucky. So as much as possible, like don't work on your own in a silo. You have to go out and kind of advocate for yourself.
And having a blog and writing regular tech blog posts makes sense. This raises your chances of getting found.
100%. I think that it'll it'll increase your chance of getting found. But not only that, I think for me at least, when I publish a YouTube video, there is some element of I want to make sure it's good because it's going to be out there in the world and everyone might be able to see it. And so it does lead me to go the extra mile and make sure it's high quality. I want to do a little bit extra research. I'm going to go a little bit deeper in the code and figure out, the the architecture of what I'm trying to present. And I think that really does make me a better developer. So knowing that you're going to publish something, for me, it forces me to go and really dig in and become a better software engineer as a result of that pressure.
Okay, I think we touched on the most important points when it comes to getting into such a job. This was really interesting, really eye-opening. Now I was wondering, at Facebook, you don't have a native Android app, right? You write your app in React Native, which is a cross-platform framework.
So we actually have mostly written in native code. Like the thing about Facebook is that Facebook is a huge company, right? We have Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, Messenger app. And if you ask me, okay, does this technology exist at Facebook? The answer for me is probably going to be yes. Like there are so many engineers and so many code bases and so many different things coming together that, yeah, there is React Native, there is Kotlin code, there is Java code, there's probably a bunch of other like things that are now deprecated that have lived inside of the Android app. So the answer is, yeah, it does have some React Native, but actually largely it's native.
And is Facebook already using Jetpack Compose?
I would say by and large, the answer is no, but I'm almost certain that I'm sure there's some team that has experimented in some way. Like, again, like the answer is that you have tens of thousands of developers. I'm sure there's like some part of the company somewhere which is experimenting with it. But as broadly speaking, I think that, Facebook is not going to be the first to pick up a brand new technology because, we need to make sure that things work.
Okay, so if someone wants to get into a big tech company right now, they definitely have to learn XML, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like when you talk about getting into the big company, we're talking largely about the interview process. And I feel like when you actually are talking about the interview process, a detail like that will very rarely come up. Like, I don't think I've ever been asked when I've been interviewing, like, hey, do you know XML or do you know Jetpack Compose? A lot of it will be, show me what you've built. And if you've built something of meaning, of value to people, either through your past work experience or a project that you've built on your own, then I have a high degree of confidence that whether it's XML or Jetpack Compose or some other technology like Flutter or React Native, I'm pretty confident that someone like you will be able to pick it up. And so I don't think that the people need to necessarily worry about, okay, I need to learn XML in order to get that job. A lot of that you're gonna have to relearn a lot of things, I'm telling you, when you get that job. So rather than trying to optimize for like how to hit the ground running, focus instead on building things that have value, and then you're going to be able to learn all that on the job.
So the only thing that really matters for these interviews are data structures and algorithms, basically.
Yeah, I'd say that once you're at the interview stage, a lot of it will be data structures and algorithms and how you communicate. So it's not just like your knowledge of DSA. It's also very much about your collaboration.
How you explain it.
And also, I think definitely in the interview, it's not just DSA. There's also going to be at least one interview which talks about, tell me what you've built. Like, tell me about your past experience. Why do you want to work at this particular company? And you should be able to eloquently describe, have eloquent answers to those.
Okay, makes sense. How much as you're willing to disclose this? You don't have to use your own example, but okay, actually we already talked about this, how much people can earn, but I think we didn't say any specific numbers, did we? We just said you get stock options and stuff like that, but what range are we talking about here? Let's say someone starts at Facebook. How much can he expect to earn at his first year at Facebook?
Yeah, there's a website called Levels.fyi, which I think does a pretty good job. It collects a bunch of anonymous data points, and you can see what that turns into. I think the short answer is that I think probably for a new grad, it'll probably be $150,000 to $200,000 in that very first year. But there's a lot of caveats there. I think it'll depend on where you are. Like the location is, if you're in India or if you're in London or if you're in Menlo Park, which in California, the answer will change. And also it depends a little bit on your past experience, right? So if you've done consulting or freelancing, maybe you'll actually come in at a higher level and your compensation will go up significantly. But if you're coming out of college and you have no prior work experience, yeah, probably that new grad package is what you can expect. And those are pretty publicly available on a website like Levels.fyi.
Okay, I will put the link to this site into the description as well, into the show notes. Those were my questions about big tech. We are almost done. What I also wanted to touch on, you teach at Stanford, right? Maybe you can say a few sentences about this, just what you do there, how you got into it, and why you do it, and what it gives you personally.
Yeah, I think the reason I do it is just I love teaching. And that was the reason that I started the YouTube channel. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is that one way I like to think about how I spend my time is I want to do things which will give me a chance to get lucky. And that's the reason why I started making YouTube videos to begin with. I have been writing on LinkedIn and Twitter and on Medium for a while now. The whole idea is that let me try and figure out ways to have non-linear outcomes. So I put in some amount of work, but that work that I do can impact many more people beyond just like the people around me. And I think YouTube and these other things are platforms which allow you to do that. And so connecting it to Stanford, I think what happened was there was an Android class at Stanford, and the person who taught that left the university. And so I knew there was an opening. And so I went to Stanford, and so I knew some of the faculty there, and I basically reached out and said, hey, what is the plan for Android? Like, will there be someone teaching it? And they said no. And they knew that I had been teaching Android for a while, and they actually saw my YouTube work, right? So YouTube was essentially my portfolio of like, Rahul has been teaching Android for a while, and it seems like people are getting value out of the content that he has. So that was basically the interview process. Like they looked at my YouTube videos, and I was very easily able to at least do a trial run of teaching. And so now I've been teaching at Stanford for 3 different quarters. Like I've taught the class 3 times. And just the ability to go back to campus and interact with students is so much fun. And I feel like there's also a benefit for me, which is that when you teach something, I mean, you certainly will know this, but when you teach something and explain something, that's really when you get to understand it in much more detail. And so I feel like that's a huge value for me. And it's actually been benefiting me whenever I make a project on my own, or if I'm doing it on my day job. I'm able to do things much faster because I know the fundamentals.
Yeah, teaching is the best way to learn, I think. In my opinion, it's the single best way to make sure you really understand something. But it's still not easy to teach something. So do you actually get paid for that, or do you do that for free?
Yeah, I don't get paid for it. It is completely like, I think technically if you are working full time, which I am, then I think there's a rule, at least at Stanford, where you're not supposed to get paid for it. So I'm just doing it, for a couple, like 10 hours a week just for fun, basically.
Yeah, it's another way to build your reputation and your personal brand, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Just like teaching on YouTube. And how many people do you have to teach at the same time?
Right now, the class has around 45 people. That's the enroll. So
Okay.
The interesting thing is that in the past 2 times that I taught it, the class was fully remote because of COVID. And so this time that I'm teaching it right now, it's actually in person. So it physically will meet at the campus, Stanford campus. And as a result of that, the enrollment limit, which is 45, which is the size of the classroom that we have.
Yeah, 45 people live teaching would be enough to trigger my social anxiety so hard that I would be really nervous. But I guess you can get used to it.
Yeah. And I think the hard part is that when you teach, there's a rule that you have to teach with your mask on because of, there's a lot of anxiety around COVID, of course. So that also makes it a little bit harder, because I feel like when you have your mask on, it's a little bit harder to really connect, and people may not hear you as well. So I'm dealing with that a little bit, but overall, it's been a really enjoyable process.
Yeah, that's funny, because having a mask on would actually really help me with my personal social anxiety in such a scenario, because when part of your face is masked, then they can't see, for example, if your lips are shaking, which can happen when you're really nervous. I just think this would help me, but I can imagine that it makes it more difficult to actually communicate with the people.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we touched on all the interesting points. This was a really efficient episode, and we got a lot of really interesting information out of this. Is there anything else that I didn't ask that you would like to mention here, or did we touch on everything important?
I think one thing I'll mention is that I feel like the YouTube journey for me is, I think I started relatively late compared to a lot of YouTubers who they've been doing videos since they were like, age 18, 20, like much earlier on. And I started, in my late 20s. And I feel like one thing that I learned is that, at least for me, when I was going through high school, college, and starting a new job, I felt like a lot of my life was automated. Like I had a very clear path of what I wanted to do, and I never really questioned it. Like the definition of success for me was very clear. Like get good grades, go to a good university, get a good job, and then do well in that job. But then I feel like I finally got to the point in my life where there was no clear definition of a next step. And that was really scary for me. I feel like I had to then take into my own hands, like, what do I want my career, my life to look like? Because I think once you get to your late 20s and people are, getting an MBA or going to law school, or they're doing all sorts of things with their career. They're going to a big company, small company. They might do freelancing. It becomes much more difficult to understand, am I doing what I should be doing? And I think that is really what led me to do some introspection. Like, what do I really care about? What do I think will give me satisfaction or happiness? And that's, I think, what triggered me to actually start creating content, which I think most people at these big tech companies, they don't do. But for me, I just felt like this is what I'd like to try it out. I think there's an opportunity for me to get lucky here. I can meet interesting people. And I'm really happy I did. So I think one message I have is, whether you're working in tech already and you feel like you've made it, or if you're trying to get into tech, I just feel like there's so much value in being comfortable with putting yourself out there and being vulnerable, like making a YouTube video, teaching something. I've really enjoyed it, and I don't regret it at all, even though it's a lot of time. That would just be my one message to people.
Yeah, I had my moment of introspection at 26. 1 month before I turned 27, I actually started learning to code from scratch, so from zero experience, apart from a little bit in high school. My CV at this time was really messed up. I studied business economics, which I did not take anything out of that. I forget everything I learned there because I was not interested in this. I was lazy. I had no ambition. For me, this changed at around 24. Then I did some stuff, and then at 26, I started learning to code. But you said that your YouTube channel helped you with this, and I also feel that creating this YouTube channel and creating this brand and putting myself out there helped me repair my bad CV in a certain way, because now I feel like I already have something. I'm kind of established in the community just because of my reach and my YouTube channel and the large following I have. So I think if you build your personal brand, which in the 21st century you usually do by creating social media content, then you can repair damage you have done in your life really quickly. If this is my way to phrase it, basically.
Yeah.
If this makes sense.
I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think the thing is that you have to be willing to try it out. You have to be willing to take that risk. Because I think, frankly speaking, if you're at a tech company like Google or Facebook, then financially, it almost certainly isn't worth it. Like the time, Like the way it works is that at the end of every performance cycle, you'll get some sort of rating. And that rating will determine your bonus. And so purely from the financial perspective, if you work an extra 10 hours a week, you can probably get one higher rating in your company. And that will translate to thousands or maybe tens of thousands of dollars in additional income. And that's way more than I make right now on YouTube, like way more, right? And so I feel like financially it just doesn't make sense. But I feel like you have to, at least for me, putting aside that part of it, the idea of having a YouTube or having some sort of content creation, it's something that you can point to and it will benefit you beyond the company. And you also learn a lot more. So I just feel like for me, it's worth it. And I think that it's something that it's worth considering depending on how you balance out the prioritization between finances, free time, learning, and reaching and helping people.
Yeah, but for many people, they end up turning their YouTube channel into a full-time business by creating courses, basically. So this is also an option. And when you make courses, you can make a lot of money. But this is also not easy work. And also a little bit of a benefit is that when you are a complete beginner and create content like I did, then you can actually make a little bit of ad revenue while you are learning. And of course, if you work at Facebook, then this ad revenue doesn't play a role at all. But if you don't have a job yet and you're a complete beginner, then this is actually a nice way to make a little bit of money on the side while you are learning all this stuff. At least I found this nice.
Exactly. And I think one other aspect is that, it is very exponential, similar to like, as you get promoted in a big tech company, when you're working on YouTube, like your growth hasn't been linear at all, right? Like your growth in the past 1 year has been way more than the growth in the 1 year prior to that. So there's also an additional opportunity there that, things start having a snowball effect with YouTube or content creation.
Yeah, although I have to say that the snowball effect can wear off a little bit because I actually think my growth rate for the last year has been stagnant. I get around 3,000 new subscribers per month. But of course, in the beginning, when I had 100 or 1,000, then this was smaller. Then I had this exponential growth. And there are ways to trigger this exponential growth again. I just have to create content that more people are interested in, which is not so easy, but it's possible. Yeah, and those were my questions. This was really interesting. So then my last question is, where can people find out more about you? And do you have anything that you want to promote? That's your chance to put everything out there, and everything you mentioned I will put into the show notes.
Yeah, perfect. So YouTube is definitely a place where I publish a lot of content. So I think we already talked about that. I also am pretty active on LinkedIn and Twitter. And then the final thing I'll plug is what we talked about earlier, the tech career growth community. Basically, I'm trying to figure out a way that we can create a product or a community which will help people, whether you're trying to get into big tech or small tech or get your first freelancing, no matter what it is you want to get into the software engineering industry. I want to be able to help you with that. So please do join the community on Slack and LinkedIn, and would love to connect with anyone.
Okay, people definitely check this out. Again, the link will be in the show notes. On YouTube, that's the video description. And later, when this audio podcast is up, then this will be the show notes, which you can find in your podcast player. Okay, then thank you for coming by in the show. It was really interesting. And I hope we talk again in the future.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. It was super fun.